Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. This is the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange webinar on international education and development careers and the work that people with disabilities are doing in this field and the opportunities that are available in the field of international education and international development if you're a person with or without a disability. And so we have today a panel of 3 individuals with different disabilities who are working, have been working in this field, and they're going to be talking about with you some of their experiences and kind of sharing with you their take on what it's been like. And overall, I think what you'll find is that there are certainly challenges, but international education and international development is actually a pretty surprisingly welcoming and also interesting field as well. So what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll have some basic ground rules. We'll go through, we have some questions we'll go through, and this is going to be about a 60-minute discussion. And my goal is that probably by about 40 minutes after, we'll be able to open up the floor for some of your questions as well. And but we'll be able to have plenty of our questions to go through until then. But yeah, if you think of anything as you're listening to the panelists talk and you want to ask them a question, we will be opening up the floor for questions further into the webinar. And so, as Monica noted earlier, we would like all of you to just keep muted if you're not talking, keep your video off if you're not a panelist or presenter, and that way we won't have any audio distractions, and it'll be easier for people who are deaf or hard of hearing to see the interpreters. And there's no slides today. It's just going to be a discussion. So there's no visuals that you're going to be missing out on or anything. And a recording of this webinar will be made available after, not immediately, but in a few weeks. And also please keep your eye out as well for a survey, which we will be sending later on today. Satisfaction surveys are helpful. They help us measure our impact, and also they help us get a sense of how we can keep improving our offerings. So I do encourage you to please fill that out when you receive it. So my name is Justin Harford, and I'm a program coordinator with the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange. I've been working here for almost 6 years, 5.5 years. And I also am a blind person, and I studied abroad a couple times for a summer in Mexico in 2008, and I did an academic year abroad in Santiago, Chile. And I guess I've been kind of working on the periphery of the international education field for these last few years. And I think what we'll do now is I'm going to invite the first of our panelists to share with you a little about themselves as well. Let's go ahead and have Callie open us up. So Callie, take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, my name is Callie Rouse. I use she, her pronouns. And I work at the University of Michigan at our Center for Global and Intercultural Study, which is the largest study abroad office. When I submitted my bio a couple of weeks ago, I was the health and safety assistant, but as of this week, I've been promoted into the role of an intercultural programs advisor. So now I'm doing full advising role. And I have had 2 significant study abroad style experiences. So I first and did a semester abroad in Prague in the Czech Republic. And then I also did research stayed with like a home, essentially a homestay family. I forgot the word. In Latvia and Lithuania prior to my senior year of college, where I was there to do some research. Yeah. I think that's the basics around it. I've been in the international education realm for a little over 6 years now.
Thanks, Callie. And I forgot to say my pronouns are he, him, his. Nick, why don't you introduce yourself too?
Thanks. So my name is Nicholas Hoekstra. I am a blind white male in his mid-30s. He is him. And so I've worked in international education in two kind of areas. I taught English abroad in both Spain and Japan. And after that, I started getting interested in international education development work. So for the last about 8 years, I've been working in international education development. So I've worked on projects financed by the USAID and as well as UN projects. It's been a great opportunity. My work has allowed me to work with over 20 countries around the world, as well as live and travel to countries as diverse as Argentina, Ecuador, Mexico, Rwanda, as well as I lived 2 years in Geneva working for the UN. So it's been a very interesting kind of two different types of international education work, but both have been extremely rewarding. And yeah, that is kind of my introduction.
Thanks, Nick. Let's go to Nicole.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Nicole Miner. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am currently a University Relations Manager with ISEP Study Abroad, where I'm also a member of our Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Task Force, or the IDEA Task Force. I live with chronic migraines, as well as major depression and generalized anxiety. And my experience abroad is mostly in Asia. I spent 3 years teaching English in Japan, studied abroad there when I was in college, but I have also been to France, Germany, and the Czech Republic, and I look forward to going more places. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's go back to Callie. So Callie, what is your disability? And when you go to, when you're starting a new place, say starting a new, when you're starting at a new job, for example, how do you disclose your disability? Do you disclose? How do you disclose? And how do you decide who to tell? Because, and I mean, actually, it's not just when you start, right? It's also kind of throughout in your interactions as new colleagues come on, as new situations emerge. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I forgot to list my disabilities. I'm not used to generally being like, hello, here's how I'm disabled. But yeah, my disabilities are, I have vision disability that causes me sometimes difficulty with being able to see. My eyes will like shake back and forth. It's called congenital nystagmus. Generally, people aren't too familiar with it, but you can get it if you're very intoxicated as well. I just get it all the time. So that can sometimes lead to problems related to like walking downstairs and being able to focus on something or like read something far away and things like that. So it's kind of like different elements of things that impact sometimes driving, things like that. And I also have generalized anxiety. And I think of them as very different kind of things when I'm thinking about disclosing. So with my vision disability, I consider it kind of like more of like a neutral kind of thing. And I'm pretty open about talking about it. It's a lot easier for people to notice that I have it. If I'm having trouble keeping my eyes focused. And so that is something that I generally talk about pretty early on with people and pretty openly with people. And I'll be like, hey, like I take medication so that I can stabilize my vision. And I have like conversations about it much more openly. So for example, when I started my initial role at the University of Michigan, I talked about it in my interview as, you know, a way that I could talk a little bit about an identity that I held that was a marginalized identity that was really important to me, that I would, in this role, be able to advocate for those with disabilities. But I wasn't, you know, coming out and saying like, I have generalized anxiety and it can be really stressful and all sorts of things, and getting into that, I feel like it's very much like much more of like a neutral kind of conversation topic. People don't really have a lot of preconceived notions around it. I've had it since I was literally a baby. And so people don't have the same level of like stigma related to it and things like that. And so, yeah, I generally talk about it. I work with my coworkers. My coworkers know I have my vision disorder. I chat about it with students occasionally if it like becomes evident that like I can't really like, they're like showing me something and I'm like, the way you're holding it, I can't read that. My eyes are going crazy and they don't like it, and things like that. Whereas it comes with my anxiety, that's a lot of a very different conversation. It's generally something I don't bring up. There's like various elements with it. There's a lot more stigma related to it. There is definitely more of a concern in the workplace that it may have an impact on the way I'm able to work, and that like I have to like speak with other people about how like I deal with it, and I'm not very comfortable like talking with people about like how I'm handling anxiety. And so I generally don't talk about it unless I'm like close with a coworker personally, or for example, if I've known a boss for a while and I feel comfortable talking with them about that, but like that's not something I would communicate with a new boss early on.
Makes sense. What about, so let's go on to Nick. What's your take on this? Do you disclose your disability? How, and how do you decide who to tell?
So yeah, I have kind of taken both approaches. It really depends on what the application process looks like for a job. There have been certainly jobs where I've applied to and everyone has known that I was visually impaired from the beginning, because they have been jobs where I've been, part of the network, where I've known people, met people within the area. And in those situations, it's been a much smoother transition. But I have had a couple instances where I have applied to a job and the factor of my blindness has not come up either until an in-person interview or until a conversation where I have already been hired, really depending on what the interview process is like. I don't necessarily make a point to disclose my visual impairment until it is necessary in the case of the interview, until I show up to the interview, or at a point where I perhaps have been hired. And there's no reason to that except for I want to be hired primarily on my merits, or my resume, my curriculum vitae. And then in the case sometimes of interviews, if it's an in-person interview, it's something that I will make a point to address during the interview, simply because I know that perhaps there are doubts in the mind of the person who is interviewing me, potentially, whether or not they express those doubts. So it's something that I might bring up kind of more organically in the interview process. But so I've taken both approaches, and it really just depends on where is the moment that is going to be the most organic to bring this up, and I want to make sure that is not something that could potentially harm my my possibility to make it to the next round of an application process.
Makes sense. I mean, how do you bring it up in the interview?
In the interview, typically I will try to bring it up when we start to discuss a particular function of the work. So, for example, one of my previous jobs required me to travel quite a bit, and obviously that was something where I knew the fact that I'm a blind individual may create some doubts as to how I was going to travel, or even there have been instances where my supervisor has asked me in the interview, how comfortable are you with traveling? And that's something where I have to be honest and say, like, look, okay, this is how I travel. And typically it's a matter of saying, these are the examples of where I've done something similar in the past. These are the examples where, myself as a blind individual have done this type of work. I've, traveled for work before, for example, or, this is examples of where I've moved to a new city and managed to navigate around the city. And maybe this is a little bit of how I do it. if you can present that in a convincing way or in a really clear way, less than convincing, if you can present that in a clear way, I actually think it can provide, it can gain you a little bit of respect and perhaps even a level of admiration by the person interviewing you, because you've already demonstrated a skill that perhaps they're not aware of. So I think it can definitely be a factor that you can spin to your advantage when it comes up.
That's great. Yeah, even despite anxiety around drivers in foreign countries, even Chilean drivers have patterns in the way that they drive that, yes, we notice. That's just a random thought that came to mind for me. Let's go to Nicole. Well, what do you think about this, Nicole?
Sure. So actually, quite a few of my coworkers are in the session right now. So I suppose this is me disclosing. So thank you all for coming to support me and this panel. I really appreciate it. But as far as historically, when I have thought about disclosing, I've been a bit like Callie, wherein I need to kind of establish some trust between myself and my coworkers, particularly my supervisor, before I feel comfortable disclosing it. And even then, I have noticed that I tend to hold back on the mental health side of things, and because of the stigma, obviously. And I tend to only present, hey, I have this chronic illness and I may need some adjustments to work around it. So it's kind of just, I think, depends on the context of, like Nick was saying, the context of the job, what the responsibilities are, and then just the interpersonal relationship that I have with somebody.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm noticing, like, you and Callie both kind of talk about the mental health part of your disabilities as being something that you're a little less interested to disclose because of the extra negativity surrounding that idea. It seems like, you have the statistics which state that, 95% of people with mental health disabilities are, peaceful, decent individuals, but then the language around mental health, insane, psycho, doesn't really imply a very peaceful group of people. You think that kind of plays into it a little bit, or is there kind of another reason that that comes to mind?
This is Nicole. I'll take that. I think definitely, you're saying, the language around psychiatric conditions predisposes people to think of it in a certain way. And I have often feared being seen as somehow weaker or incapable because of sort of the preconceived notions that people have about those disabilities. That it just doesn't, I feel like there's kind of this metaphor of like the broken leg that goes around often, wherein people are more likely to be sympathetic to a broken leg, something physical, than they are kind of a mental health kind of condition. And I've found that to be the case, which is unfortunate.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that. Some of these questions, guys, I'm coming up with off my head, but going back to the agenda and going on to the next question. Nicole, have you ever had to ask for a reasonable accommodation? And if so, how did you navigate that process?
Yeah, I have. And it was kind of a nerve-wracking process, I'll be honest. There was a lot of paperwork involved. I needed to, because I see several different specialists, I needed to sort of coordinate everybody's responses and what everybody was saying. And in the end, some things were approved for me and some things were not. So for example, I was able to have a lamp in my office that the university purchased for me because I can't use fluorescent lighting or it triggers my migraines. So Um, that was something that they were able to accommodate, but some things like schedule changes, things like that, weren't necessarily as easy for them to accommodate, and they did their best. But sometimes it's not quite enough, and you sort of suffer a little bit.
That makes sense. It's kind of some of your job involves like a lot of like student facing type roles where there's hours when students are around and you got to be for those, or
Correct. Yeah.
yeah, makes sense. Okay, so let's go to Callie. Callie, have you ever had to ask for reasonable accommodation? How'd you navigate that process?
Yeah, so one of them is actually one of the times I actually had to request accommodation was not related to like one thing I would consider as like a major disability of mine. But I also have plantar fasciitis, or not plantar fasciitis, different thing, ulnar tunnel in my my hands, and I've had to go through the process of getting a specialized keyboard for myself, because if I type on a regular keyboard, I get a lot of flare-ups and it's like really hard. I like hyperextend my hands. And so it actually ended up being a really kind of like helpful situation where it was a situation where I was dealing with a really good department itself, because the bureaucracy was going to be a long time. If I was going to go through the proper system channels and things like that, then I would have had to get evaluated by like the special ergonomic people, and they would have had to connect with my PT or my OT, and like check and see if like they thought I was, I deserved the accommodation if it was a reasonable obligation for them to have. That was going to be a month, like a months long process, because there's such a huge backlog, and I was dealing with the pain daily then. And I actually ended up having a really wonderful department that just said, yeah, we'll pay for the $200 laptop or keyboard straight up front. Like, it's fine, we'll cover it. We won't make you go through the process to like make it cheaper for us. So that was something that was really nice that I had. Another element is actually related with my anxiety, and this is something that I kind of communicated with my boss at a later time, with regards to it. Like, sometimes if I'm like very anxious while I'm working and things like that, noise can start to bother me. It can start to be like a little bit hypersensitive to noise. And so one thing that I was able to get was these nice headphones that I was able to wear throughout my work. Prior to my current job as an advisor, I worked out in a cubicle. And so it was really disruptive to have people, around me, and not being able to like physically put myself behind a door. And so that was something that was really important. And I also was able to get a thing that if it was like a really like stressful day, and this was of course before work from home was a thing, that I was able to like go into a conference room and work if it was like extremely disruptive for me. And that was something where it did have to go through like documentation, and we had to provide documentation and things like that. But they were able to just be like, yep, that's like totally reasonable to ask, especially as somebody who works out among, especially because there were like loud students near us at the time. They've luckily moved on, but there were a lot of loud students nearby. And so I was able to get that. But one was kind of a situation where we went around the formal processes because it was going to take a really long time. And I think you have to be aware that that's potentially a thing. And sometimes it's better to be approaching them earlier rather than later, because you may be looking at a lengthy process, whereas the other one was at least quicker. Yeah.
Probably the formal processes are more expensive than the accommodation. Thinking about the
Probably.
expertise you'd have to call on. And what do you
Fees for
think, Nick?
filling out paperwork.
Yeah, yeah, and having imagine the time of a orthopedic specialist, I mean, it costs more than a couple $100 on a keyboard. I use a keyboard that I use a keyboard from Kinesis that is one of those that it has it's split in half. Halves are set up vertically, so essentially the hands are typing with palms facing each other.
I have a Kinesis that's also split, and it's like, so I can have like my shoulders like at a normal angle and then set instead of like scrunched together. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Nick, what do you think? How have you asked for RAs and what strategies have you used?
For me, it's depended a little bit on, again, on the place of work. And it's usually really revolved around just like an honest conversation with both a supervisor as well as like the Department of Human Resources at the places where I've done quite a bit of work as a consultant. And when you work as a consultant, oftentimes less opportunities where an organization will provide you a reasonable accommodation, but sometimes there are. But it's one of those things where you have to have an honest conversation with the person that is, your supervisor, and hopefully they can advocate on your behalf. So there have been times where I've had to take my own laptop to use with a speech synthesizer, so a speech to text software installed. But there have been other times where my organization has decided to purchase that software so that they can install it on a computer of their own, especially in organizations where there's concerns about privacy, so it's in their best interest to have the software. And then eventually, a lot of places where I've worked, they've discovered, these accommodations, they work for Nick, but also, if we hire somebody else that has this need in the future, we already have it, or we only need to update it. So it's really, it has never been a huge imposition to the places where I've worked. Most often they've been pretty flexible, but it's just required like very clear communication about my needs too, and also ensuring that I get the specific speech synthesizer that I'm accustomed to using, because that also has an impact on my productivity. If I'm given a software that maybe meets my needs, but it's not one that I'm accustomed to using, that's only going to go so far to helping me be able to work. So again, yeah, clear conversations and working with people, and oftentimes it ends up being a very back and forth discussion with human resources or an IT department of saying like, hey guys, you installed this, but it's not working because of this other security software that you have, or maybe we need to look at getting me a laptop because I only have this software installed on one computer, but I'm the note taker for the group, so I need to be able to take notes in any room. So things like that. But by and large, I've had a fairly positive experience everywhere I've worked.
Nick, have you ever had to deal with any resistance in the field, and how did you manage?
Yeah, so definitely, I've had to deal with resistance in a couple different places. Resistance in terms of like, once I've been hired, in terms of people, coworkers saying like, well, I don't see how this person, how they're doing their work, or even on one instance, I had a supervisor who said, well, I don't see how Nick can travel to another country to, for their project. And in those instances, I've benefited a lot from finding allies within my workplace, within my organization. In most cases, it's been coworkers who have, been there to speak on my behalf, or simply to kind of lend an ear to, help me talk through problems, or to, just make sure that that's so rooting for me. It really depends on the workplace, but in the case where where a supervisor was reluctant to have me travel for a project, it was a trip to, at the time, to Cambodia. And my supervisor had some doubts as to whether I'd be able to travel to Cambodia as a person with a disability and complete my work there. But both a coworker was willing to step forward and say, look, the project intends for 2 people to be going. I will be, with Nick. I'm, I trust Nick and I think he'd be a great benefit to travel with me. I'd like him to go with me. I'd like to have his aid on this, project. So, it was really important to have that ally. And what's really important is once I completed that first trip and the supervisor I had saw that, hey, Nick was able to travel to Cambodia, and not only was he able to do his work, but the people in Cambodia really appreciated his presence. Then it was immediately, okay, how can we get him traveling to all of the next, project countries? So it's really been one of those situations where, yes, there's been resistance, and I've found allies. And once I kind of get past that resistance, even sometimes those people who were initially reluctant become enthusiastic. I think they've seen the potential. And something I think we might talk about a little bit later on is when you talk about there are some instances of where your disability can even be a strength in particular situations, and we can come back to that later. But I've definitely had people who were initially reluctant become very positive once I was able to kind of demonstrate my ability to complete a job task.
That's great. What do you think about this question? Have you ever had to deal with any resistance, or and how did you manage?
Yeah, definitely. And I am smiling broadly at this question. I would say that I have experienced resistance, and I put up with it for maybe longer than I should have, and eventually chose to use the nuclear option, which was to leave because they were not being flexible. And that was, I hope to never have to do that again, because I really enjoyed what I was doing and the people that I was doing it with, but it eventually became kind of impossible for me to continue.
So just kind of reluctance to provide an accommodation that you are needing.
Right.
Got it. Yeah. What about you, Callie?
So I would actually say I've been pretty lucky in the fact that I really haven't had to deal with that. Majority of my challenges related to my accommodations and things like that were actually when I was a child. For some reason, becoming an adult gave me a lot better situation, and have seemed to not fight with people around accommodations. And I think partially because of the nature of more independence, it has allowed me to be able to maneuver things easier without having to ask other people for assistance in making things possible for me to continue to work on something or be able to study something. So mine's actually been pretty decent so far as an adult.
What do you think some of the strengths are of people with disabilities in the workplace?
Me again?
What do you, yeah, you, yeah. Callie, what do you think some of the strengths are of having a disability in international ed?
Yeah. So I think one of the benefits is related to being able to connect with the community of other disabled people. So like I mentioned, I mentioned it in my interview as a member that I was a member of this marginalized identity, and that it was something that I was really interested in. And I was able to, after I started the job, I saw that there really wasn't any huge disability work that we were doing at the time. And I was able to be the head of our disability kind of accommodations, expansions, thinking about how we can be more inclusive of students with disabilities, how we can make the accommodations process easier for our students going abroad. And I think it was super important to be bringing in that perspective of somebody who's had to, get accommodations to the student, and is familiar with the kind of confusing process around it, and also aware of, the big challenge, one of the big challenges in, sending students abroad is that students don't disclose. And I think it can be really frustrating for people who are able-bodied and be like, why don't you disclose this information if you need supports? but being able to, know like from personal experience, like, yeah, well, in actuality, there's a lot of reasons not to disclose, especially if students don't think that they're going to be able to get into the programs they want to do, be able to go abroad where they want to go due to their disability and due to perceptions about how far they can go, what they. So I think it's been really beneficial to be able to understand those students from a personal level, and I'm like now our like key person for any disability question in our office.
Nice. Nice. What do you think, Nick? I know you were not up to date to talk about strengths. What do you think about strengths of having a disability in international education or development?
Yeah, I think there are two strengths, two categories of strengths that I consider. One kind of echoing what Kaylee just said. One of the, depending on your position and the type of work that you do, when I've worked in international education development, one of the really important strengths in a person with disability that works in international education development is that, especially when I'm working with colleagues in other countries or traveling to other countries, it can be a bit of an eye-opener for the people that I'm working with. And it can make them reflect on, here's a person with a disability who is doing this job, who is working in education. What have I not considered myself as far as getting students with disabilities more engaged in education? Or what do I have to do in my own country, in my own, workplace to facilitate more individuals with disabilities? So it's kind of helped, I think, other people to reflect upon their own workplaces or their own kind of educational systems in some regards. I think that's one important strength. I think it's one of the biggest strengths of what we can do as far as just more people with disabilities working in any field, but really in the international education field. I think we're all kind of paving ways in our own forms. The other kind of categories of strengths, I think, is again kind of reflecting what is you kind of become that go-to person within an organization, within an office of, oh, we have a question about disability. Even sometimes when it's not about your disability, you end up, I think, fielding some questions, but it also can help your workplace start to expand its own areas of work, or to consider different areas of work that maybe they hadn't before. I know one of the areas when I started working in international education, I worked on projects that didn't touch upon disability directly, but because I was in the office and because I shared my interest in this, other projects started to reach out to me and say, hey, can you talk to us about, what do we have to do to consider students with visual impairments for reading? Or what do we have to consider, universal design for learning? How can we incorporate this into our projects? So it helped people around me and within my own office to broaden their own kind of scopes of work that they were tackling. So those are just kind of two, I think, ways that we as individuals with disabilities working in international education can really kind of help promote greater awareness as well as support it.
That's great. So let's move on to Nicole. What do you think, Nicole, are some of the strengths of having a disability in international ed?
I think it's very difficult to follow up on Nick. But I think for me personally, I have found that being a person with a chronic pain condition specifically makes me generally just more resilient and more able to get through things. But also, so many of our students now have some sort of chronic illness, take medication for, and I think it gives me kind of a perspective on things that maybe even the student themselves may not have considered before signing up for a study abroad program. So students wondering, how am I going to get my medication abroad? What happens if I have to go see a doctor abroad and need to ask for my medication? What if they don't offer it? What if it's illegal to bring in the country? Those are things that I've had to consider before. So I feel like I have a good point of view and some experience to be able to share.
That's great. I'm going to probably combine, Nicole, some of these questions up ahead here. You kind of alluded to this before. There are some workplaces you've had where experiences you've had where you had to leave because of difficulty obtaining accommodations. And so how do you find a place to work? And before applying, how do you figure out if you're going to have a supportive culture there? And that could also include, red flags. And for example, the online resources, the website, language used. And yeah, well, you've had to excuse yourself one time. So how do you navigate that when you're trying to figure out a place to work, Nicole?
Yeah, it can be difficult, but I have found that as far as sort of feeling out a work culture, it does help to take a look maybe at their online resources, at their website, and see, what is the language that they're using, not only around just international education in general, like is it prominent on their website? What about diversity? What about disability? How are those things being treated electronically? Like, what is their digital message to people who are just coming onto their website? So I think that can be a really good indicator, but it's of course not perfect, right? You can have people who talk the talk kind of a thing, or other way around, talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. So I think it's important also to get to know your coworkers and to, for me, it's involved being more open about what I'm going through, like doing this panel, because that helps eventually for people to build empathy and to start to create new resources and that sort of thing where they might not have already.
I think we need more people who walk the walk and don't talk the talk.
Very true.
Let's go to Callie. What do you think, Callie? How do you find a place to work? And that includes, looking for red flags, trying to identify if a culture is supportive. And have you ever had to leave a place because of it wasn't working out? What was that decision like?
Yeah, so I'm still pretty early in my career. So in international education, it's been pretty good for me so far. But I think some things that were indicative that where I was going to be looking to work and where I continue to be working now would be a good place for me was two elements that are kind of similar to what Nicole mentioned. One is like a really strong emphasis on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And explicitly asking their candidates what they would bring to the table in regards to DEI. That was where I was able to talk about my personal identities that I held and people that I'd connected to, and other things like being like a real student and being low SES and all things like that. And I thought that was really important, and I could tell definitely from the interviewer side later on when we were bringing in other new members of our team, that it was a really great way of like really showing us like if somebody was going to bring something unique to the team, and the people that couldn't answer that question well weren't going to fit well into the team. They didn't have, they hadn't been thinking consciously about what are we going to do for our diverse student population and advocate for them. And so I think that was a really wonderful question that was helpful then, and it was also helpful being the one asking that question. And I think another element, it was that I work at a frankly pretty like white privileged campus and things like that. But my office looks very visibly diverse, has a lot of diverse identities, both visible and not non-visible, and things like that. And I think that was a really large indicator too, that like we are not just like a bunch of white able-bodied people, trying to support students. I think the fact that we look like the student population that we want to bring in, I think was really important to me as well, and being able to kind of demonstrate that this was going to be an office that I would fit in well with.
That's great. And moving on to Nick, what do you think about this, Nick? How do you find a place to work?
There's very little I can add that my co-participants haven't already added. I think it's really that looking at mission statements, looking at how does this, how does it present itself facing outward, the types of photos that it has on the internet, on their websites, the types of projects that they've run. Obviously, for me, the photo is less of an issue, but if I'm with somebody else, I can ask them what type of photos are on their websites. Do they represent diversity? Do they represent inclusion? Those for me are like super important. And Justin and I had discussed this kind of in the past. Sometimes the fact that the fact that an organization's website may not be accessible, it might throw up a red flag, and it could be that it's not accessible because no one's ever pointed it out, or it could be not accessible because they don't want to make the effort. And that's a little bit hard to know, on the outset, but that's kind of starts to get into when it's time to leave an organization, or when I have felt that it's time to leave a position, is when you've identified that inclusion is not an aspect of their mission and of their goals, and when that's been expressed that, hey, we're not really interested in this, it's not really our time, it's not really what we believe in or what we're working towards. And for me, that's been the time where I've said, okay, well, that's not for me then. My interest is continuing to work in an area that promotes inclusion, and if I identify that the place where I'm working isn't doing that, then that's kind of the red flag for me then to finally take my leave.
You once had a supervisor that didn't think special education was worth the while.
Yes, exactly. No, I once had a supervisor who didn't really believe in inclusion, didn't believe it was possible or that it was practical. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. I'm not really, I do believe in inclusion, and that's what I want to work towards. So obviously, if this is the person that is kind of directing my work, then I knew that my work wasn't going to be moving in that direction. So I started to look for an organization that kind of had within its mission statement more of that focus on inclusion. And sometimes, it takes a couple tries. And I think that's more and more with our, with younger generations, as we start to, we may have to jump around a little bit to find where we're happiest, but it's important to take those risks. It's important to know when it's time to quit.
That's great. We're about 48 past the hour. So I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. And if in the audience have any questions for the panelists, I think this would be a great time to ask those. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like with websites, I do sometimes, it's helpful when you go to a website and you find information on how you can ask for a reasonable accommodation in the interview process. I think that's that stands out a lot. It is kind of strange though, if for the sighted people. I mean, if you go to to compare the physical to the virtual world, if you go to a place like Eugene, Oregon, there's sidewalks are very manicured and orderly, and the street corners are very modern, and everything is very sort of clean, and you can pretty much walk looking straight ahead of you and not worry that you're going to trip over something or walk off a big curb. And then you go to a developing part of the world, go to any city in Mexico, and you've got this part of the sidewalk's broken up, this curb is 2 inches off the street, this curb is 2 feet off the street, and there's a lot of here's an overhang, here's a wire coming down, and it's sort of like the difference between many websites on the internet is the difference between Eugene and pick your city in Mexico or anywhere in the developing world. Just a lot of chaos and kind of disorder on a website, and it's hard to describe it if you've never used a screen reader before, but we try not to let it change our minds about applying to a place, but it could be an opportunity, but it can also be sort of something that maybe doesn't cause you to turn away from a place, but it can be a red flag. It can cause you to hesitate. Monica, do we see any questions in the chat box?
Nope, we don't have any questions yet.
Okay, all righty. I don't know, I might ask, do the panelists have any questions for each other?
I actually just wanted to kind of point out something that, this is Nicole, something that Callie said earlier. Callie, when you were mentioning applying for accommodations, you used the word deserve. You said, do I deserve accommodations? And that really struck me that you used that language, because like we were talking about language, that kind of, of course you deserve it. You're a perfectly good human being that has a disability and you deserve the accommodation. It's a question of can your workplace work to accommodate that, or do they consider it not reasonable?
Yeah, it seems like the premise of having people go through to see a specialist and be evaluated for this, that, and the other. And the premise is that, like a reasonable accommodation queen, you're going to be asking for something that you don't need. And I guess I've never been in a world where non-disabled people were really excited to be pinned out as the disabled person using the ergonomic keyboard, but it seems like probably wiser people than me understand that better. But from my limited experience, it seems like that's kind of the premise.
It's funny you mentioned that, particularly because I caught myself saying that and I was like, oh, because the thing is I definitely feel like I've been steeped in like the language around of hearing people and things like that, and being hit back or like being pushed back with the idea of like, oh, but you don't deserve that. Like, we get to decide, us as laymen get to decide if this is like, you're deserving of this. And I think like a little bit of that came out being like, do they have the right? Yeah.
Justin, this is Monica. I've got a question for everybody. So why international education or international development? What do you see are those like biggest, I guess, points that really drew you into the field? And then do you see yourself staying into it long term? Nicole, do you want to start?
Sure, I can. I feel like probably my story is the same as so many others in our field, which is that I went abroad and loved it and wanted to give back to the field that had given me so much. But it so happens that education abroad and international education tend to be fairly progressive fields. And so the people who are in them also tend to be fairly progressive and forward thinking. And so it helps in the diversity and inclusion aspect a lot of times, to feel safe in this community. And then there was a second part of your question.
How do you see it? You staying in the field long term?
Oh gosh, I'm never gonna leave. I'm stuck here forever.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. How about you, Nick?
Sure. I mean, again, similar to what Nicole said, but I actually had the experience where when I was teaching abroad, I was asked to volunteer in a school for the blind in Japan. I taught for 2 years in Japan, and when I went to teach at the school for the blind, I prepared a bunch of materials and thought I was going to do a great job. And when I got to the school, the director of the school said, "No, we don't actually want you to teach. We just wanted the students here to see that there's some option in their lives other than becoming musicians or massage therapists," which is the typical trajectories that they have. And it really made me reflect on, I was raised kind of with this idea that I could do any job that I wanted to, could pursue any field that I wanted to. My education really supported me to do that, whereas that's not the case everywhere. That's not even the case everywhere within the United States, don't get me wrong. But it just really made me reflect that this is an area where I would like to do more work. I'd really like to promote more inclusion within education globally. So.
Great. Thanks,
That's
Nick.
great. What do you think, Callie?
Yeah, so I actually fell into international education. I was laid off from the position I had previously just due to the reduction in that particular job. And I was frantically searching for a new job, and I found one, the health and safety assistant position. And I was like, oh my God, this is perfect for me. This is a longer story, but I ended up actually having to have surgery for not a disability related reason, just a fun other reason, while I studied abroad in Prague. And so I had the unique experience of having to deal with medical systems in a foreign country, and it was very stressful for me. And so I was like, oh, this is perfect for me. And after I got into the position, I found that I had a really deep interest in working with students, which has led me to now becoming an advisor instead of just working kind of more on the administrative side of study abroad. And I don't know if I will exactly stay in study abroad itself, but I definitely think I really enjoy working with college students in particular. And I've loved my experiences international, and I think they're really important and foundational for students to experience.
Yeah, my international exchange was a pretty life-changing experience, and I learned a lot and gained a lot of confidence from it. And so, of course, I was wanting to get into that, and I think I like the field because you meet all kinds of interesting people in it. And yeah, I don't know where in the world I would ever meet a group like this, like the three panelists here, if I wasn't working at my USA. And so people who have been abroad, I think they have a more interesting kind of broad point of view about the world too. And I think more likely to read, more likely to try different experiences and to think outside the box. And it's nice to be able to be around people like that. Well, we're at about 58 after, and Monica, I don't think there's any more questions, are there? Nope. So, all right, everybody. Well, thanks for coming to the webinar. Happy National Disability Employment Month. We should have a recording up in a few weeks, and you should get a satisfaction survey in a few hours. And keep an eye out on our newsletter to be notified about the next time that we have a webinar. I think we will be having a few webinars over the next couple of months. So you'll be notified about that. And let's see, what else do we need to know? Anything else, Monica, that we need to share?
No, I don't. I think you got it. Yeah, we have a few more webinars. I think there's International Education Week next month. So we'll definitely have some stuff coming forward during that time.
Great. Well, sounds great. Well, everybody have a great week, and we'll keep in touch and have a great rest of National Disability Employment Month.